What is a government? And where did ours come from? The American government wasn't just invented overnight. It's the result of centuries of big ideas, heated arguments, and even a bloody revolution. It's a story that starts with colonists who are fed up with a king, and it continues today with debates we see on the news. We're going to trace that story. We'll see how a small group of colonies broke away from the world's biggest empire, tried one government that failed, and then created a second one, the Constitution, that has lasted for over 230 years. This is the story of how we the people decided to govern ourselves. Long before the Revolution, the first colonists were already practicing a form of self-government. Even though they were technically ruled by the King of England, they were thousands of miles away. They had to make their own rules to survive. When the Pilgrims landed, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was basically a promise to stick together and follow the laws their own group created. They also brought ideas from England. The Magna Carta, from way back in 1215, had introduced the radical idea that a king wasn't all-powerful. The English Bill of Rights gave people protections, like the right to a fair trial. So, for 150 years, the colonists got very, very used to freedom and to having a say in their own lives. So what went wrong? In a word, money. In the 1760s, Great Britain fought a long and expensive war against France. To pay off its massive debt, the British government decided to tax the American colonists. They passed the Stamp Act on paper goods, the Tea Act on tea, and many others. This made the colonists furious, not just because of the money, but because of the principle. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no voice in the laws being passed. Their cry became, "No taxation without representation." It was a protest that the government was taking their property without their permission or their consent. By 1776, the colonists had had enough. A committee led by Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. This document is so much more than a breakup letter. It's the core of the American idea. It states that all people are born with rights that no government can take away. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it makes its most important point, that governments are created by the people and get their power from the people. And if a government fails to protect its people's rights, the people have the right to change it or get rid of it. With these words, the 13 colonies declared themselves a new, independent nation. After winning the Revolutionary War, the 13 new states needed to create a government. Their first attempt was called the Articles of Confederation. But remember, they had just escaped a powerful king. They were terrified of creating another strong central government. So, they did the exact opposite. They created a government that was incredibly weak. The Articles were basically a league of friendship. The 13 states kept all the important powers, and the new United States government was just a small committee that couldn't do much of anything. How weak were the Articles? The central government had no power to tax. If it needed money for an army, it had to ask the states, and the states could just say no. It couldn't regulate trade, so states were getting into tariff wars with each other, and it couldn't even raise its own army. The breaking point came with Shays's rebellion, when a group of angry farmers in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, shut down the state courts because their farms were being foreclosed. The national government was powerless to stop it. This event scared everyone. It was proof that the new country was falling into chaos and that the Articles had to be fixed. In 1787, leaders from every state except Rhode Island met in Philadelphia. Their official job was just to revise the Articles. But very quickly, men like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton argued that they needed to throw the whole thing out and start fresh. For 4 hot summer months, they debated, argued, and compromised in secret. Their goal was to find a Goldilocks solution, a government that was strong enough to tax, raise an army, and unite the states, but not so strong that it would become a tyranny. The plan they came up with was the United States Constitution. The first big idea in the Constitution was to split the government's power. To prevent a king-like figure from emerging, they divided the new national government into 3 equal parts, or branches. This is the system you know today. The legislative branch, Congress, would make the laws. The executive branch, the president, would enforce the laws. And the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, would interpret the laws. By separating these powers, no one branch could ever become all-powerful. The second big idea was checks and balances. This is even more clever. The founders gave each branch a way to check or block the power of the other 2. It's like a game of rock, paper, scissors, designed to force them to cooperate. For example, Congress passes a law, but the president can veto it. That's a check. But if Congress really wants the law, it can gather a 2/3 vote to override the veto. That's a check back. And if that law is unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can strike it down. That's the ultimate check. The third big idea, and the main solution to the failed articles, is federalism. Federalism is just the name for sharing power. Instead of the states having all the power, like in the articles, or the national government having all the power, like a king, they decided to split the to-do list. The Constitution gives the national government certain enumerated powers, like declaring war and printing money. The powers it doesn't list are reserved for the states, like running schools and managing local elections. And some powers, like taxes, are shared. This balance is the foundation of our entire system. Just because the Constitution was written didn't mean it was law. It had to be ratified or approved by 9 of the 13 states. This started a huge national debate, dividing the country into 2 groups. The Federalists, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, supported the Constitution. They wrote a series of brilliant essays called the Federalist Papers to argue that a strong, united government was essential for survival. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists. They were patriots like Patrick Henry, who were terrified of the new plan. They argued that the new national government was too big, too powerful, and would eventually swallow up the states. Their biggest complaint? It didn't have a Bill of Rights to protect citizens. The Anti-Federalists' argument was powerful. To get the Constitution passed, the Federalists had to make a deal. This was the Great Compromise. They promised that as soon as the new government was formed, the very first thing they would do is add a Bill of Rights, and they kept their word. In 1791, the first 10 amendments were added. These amendments don't give you rights. They protect the rights you are already born with from the government. They guarantee your freedom of speech, religion, and the press, your right to a fair trial, and so much more. This compromise is what got our nation off the ground. The new government started with President George Washington, who set countless traditions, like serving only 2 terms. Almost immediately, the first political parties formed around his top advisors. Alexander Hamilton's Federalists wanted a strong government that would boost trade and industry. Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans wanted a smaller government and a nation of farmers. Just a few years later, in 1803, the Supreme Court made a huge power move. In the case of Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Supreme Court had the power of judicial review. This means the court can cancel any law from Congress or any action from the President if it violates the Constitution. This power wasn't written in the Constitution, but it has become a key part of our government. The new government's greatest test came in 1861. The country had been bitterly divided for decades over the issue of slavery. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, 11 southern states decided to secede or leave the United States to form their own country. The Civil War was a brutal, bloody conflict, but it was also a constitutional crisis. The core question was whether the Union was permanent, or if a state could just leave when it didn't like a law. The Union's victory in 1865 settled the question for good. The federal government is supreme, and the United States is one nation, indivisible. After the Civil War, the government was reborn. Congress passed 3 revolutionary amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery everywhere in the U.S. The 14th Amendment is maybe the most important one after the Bill of Rights. It granted citizenship to everyone born here, including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed equal protection of the laws to everyone. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. These are called the Reconstruction Amendments, and they changed the whole game. Before this, the Bill of Rights only protected you from the federal government. These new amendments gave the federal government the power to go into the states and protect citizens' rights from their own state governments. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, America was changing fast. Big factories, giant companies called trusts, and crowded, dirty cities created a whole new set of problems. In response, the progressive movement demanded that the government step in and clean up the mess. This led to major changes. The 17th Amendment was passed, which let citizens vote directly for their senators, making the government more democratic. And after a long, hard fight, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, finally giving women the right to vote. The government was now also breaking up giant monopolies and passing laws, like the Pure Food and Drug Act. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the country plunged into the Great Depression. Millions of people lost their jobs, homes, and savings. The government's old hands-off approach wasn't working. So in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected and promised a New Deal. The New Deal completely changed the role of government in America. For the first time, the federal government took direct responsibility for the well-being of its citizens. It created alphabet soup agencies like the CCC and WPA to give people jobs building parks and roads. It created the FDIC to protect your bank savings. And most importantly, it created Social Security, a permanent safety net for the elderly and unemployed. The federal government was now a massive part of daily life. Even after the Reconstruction Amendments, especially in the South, Jim Crow laws enforced strict racial segregation. Black and white citizens were forced to use separate schools, water fountains, and restaurants. And states used poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent black citizens from voting. In 1954, the Civil Rights Movement won a massive victory. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court declared that separate schools were inherently unequal and unconstitutional. This ruling was the beginning of the end for legal segregation. It also signaled that the federal government was finally going to use its power to enforce the 14th Amendment. The Brown decision was a legal victory, but it took a massive, non-violent movement led by figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to force real change. This movement pressured Congress and the President to act, leading to 2 of the most important laws in our history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate in any public place, like a restaurant or hotel, and in hiring for jobs. 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned all the tricks states were using to stop minorities from voting, like literacy tests. It even allowed the federal government to send its own agents into the South to register voters. This was a powerful statement. The federal government would now actively protect the right to vote for all citizens. If you learn one thing today, let it be this: the history of American government is not a finished story. The Constitution is called a living document for a reason. It's been formally changed 27 times, and our understanding of it changes with every new generation. Our government was born from arguments between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It was tested by the Civil War. It was expanded by the New Deal and forced to live up to its ideals by the Civil Rights Movement. The story of our government is the ongoing story of we the people, figuring out what that phrase really means.